The red and blue lights exploded across the dashboard like fireworks, casting an eerie glow through the evening darkness as Captain David Santos felt his stomach drop. In his 23 years of law enforcement, he had been on the other side of this scenario thousands of times, but tonight he was just another civilian in a Honda Accord, his wife Maria beside him, both of them heading home from their anniversary dinner. "Just a routine stop, honey," David murmured to Maria, his voice carrying the calm authority that had earned him his captain's bars, though his hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. Something felt different about this stop, the aggressive way the patrol car had accelerated behind them, the harsh spotlight that now blazed through their rear window like an accusation. Maria Santos, a social worker who had spent 15 years advocating for families in crisis, recognized the signs of escalation before her husband did. The officers approaching their vehicle moved with a swagger that spoke of power unchecked, their hands resting too casually on their weapons, their faces set in expressions of barely contained hostility. "License and registration," the lead officer barked without preamble as David lowered his window. Officer Michael Torres, according to his name tag, was young, maybe late 20s, with the kind of aggressive posture that David recognized from his early days training recruits, the kind that usually got smoothed out with experience and proper supervision. "Of course, officer," David replied, reaching slowly for his wallet. "I'm Captain David Santos with the Metropolitan Police Department. My credentials are." "I don't care if you're the Pope," Torres interrupted, his voice rising a notch. "License and registration. Now." David's training kicked in even as alarm bells started ringing in his head. He had seen this before, young officers drunk on authority, resistant to any challenge to their control of a situation. But he had also seen how quickly these situations could be diffused with the right approach. "Here's my license," David said calmly, handing over both his civilian driver's license and his police identification. "And my wife has the registration." "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle," Torres commanded, his flashlight now blazing directly into Maria's face. "For what?" Maria asked, squinting against the harsh light. Her voice carried the calm professionalism she used in court testimonies, but David could hear the edge of concern underneath. "What's the reason for the stop?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Torres' partner, Officer Janet Williams, moved around to Maria's side of the car, her hand now visibly resting on her service weapon. The body language was all wrong. David could see it, feel it in the tension that suddenly electrified the warm summer air. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle right now," Williams repeated, her voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. David felt the familiar weight of his own service weapon beneath his jacket, a weight that now felt more like a burden than a comfort. His mind raced through department protocols, de-escalation techniques, and the careful dance of professional courtesy that usually govern interactions between law enforcement officers. But something was wrong here, fundamentally wrong, and he could feel the situation sliding away from anything that resembled normal procedure. "Officers, if I could just explain," David began, but Torres had already moved to Maria's door. "Out of the car, now." Maria looked at her husband, her dark eyes reflecting the flashing lights and something else, a fear that David had never seen before in all their years of marriage. In that moment, Captain David Santos realized that his badge, his rank, and his 23 years of service might not be enough to protect the woman he loved from the very system he had sworn to serve. Maria Santos stepped out of the Honda with the same dignity she carried into hostile courtrooms, but Officer Janet Williams was already positioning herself like a predator circling prey. The cool night air carried the scent of jasmine from nearby gardens, a cruel contrast to the violence brewing in the fluorescent glare of the squad car's headlights. "Hands where I can see them," Williams barked, though Maria's hands were already raised, palms open, in a gesture of compliance that came from years of working with volatile situations in her social work career. David watched his wife comply with every command, his police captain's mind automatically cataloging the violations of protocol unfolding before him. No reasonable suspicion articulated. No explanation of the traffic violation. No professional courtesy extended despite his clear identification. The two officers were operating outside every guideline he had spent decades implementing and enforcing. "Officers Torres and Williams," David said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command that had earned respect in precincts across the city. He held up his captain's shield, the gold badge catching the harsh light. "I'm Captain Santos, Metro PD. Perhaps we can discuss whatever traffic violation you observed and resolve this quickly." Torres snatched the badge from David's hand with deliberate disrespect, barely glancing at it before tossing it back. "I don't know you, and I don't care about your rank. Your wife was argumentative and uncooperative. I asked a simple question about the reason for the stop," Maria said, her voice steady despite the tremor David could detect beneath the surface. "That's my constitutional right." The word constitutional seemed to flip a switch in Williams. Her face hardened, and she stepped closer to Maria, close enough that David could see his wife instinctively lean back. Your constitutional right, Williams sneered. You people always think you know the law better than we do. David felt ice form in his veins. 23 years of law enforcement had taught him to recognize the signs, the casual dehumanization, the shift from professional protocol to personal animosity, the dangerous moment when an officer stopped seeing a citizen and started seeing a target. Officer Williams, David said, stepping forward, I need you to step back from my wife. Right now. Or what? Torres challenged, his hand moving to his baton. You going to write us up, Captain? File a complaint with Internal Affairs? A second patrol car arrived, its occupants emerging with the aggressive swagger that suggested they had been briefed to expect resistance. Officers Mike Peterson and Danny Rodriguez, both young, both carrying themselves with the kind of barely contained aggression that David had seen destroy careers and communities. What's the situation? Peterson called out, his hand already resting on his weapon. Couple of troublemakers, Torres responded without taking his eyes off David. The woman's being uncooperative, and the husband thinks his badge means something on my beat. David realized with growing horror that he was witnessing something he had hoped never existed in his department. The coordinated effort to escalate rather than de-escalate. These officers weren't making mistakes. They were making choices. Ma'am, turn around and place your hands behind your back, Williams ordered Maria. For what charge? Maria asked, her social worker training kicking, and even as David could see her hands beginning to shake. Resisting arrest. You can't arrest her for anything, David said, his captain's voice cutting through the night air like a blade. You haven't stated a charge, you haven't read her rights, and you haven't established probable cause for any crime. The four officers exchanged glances, and David recognized the moment when a situation crossed from merely unprofessional to actively dangerous. It was the same look he had seen in the eyes of suspects who had decided that violence was their only option. Captain Santos, Torres said, his voice carrying a mockery that made David's badge feel like a piece of tin. You're about to learn that rank don't mean nothing when you're not wearing the uniform. The first blow came without warning. Officer Williams' baton striking Maria across her shoulder blades as she turned to comply with the order to place her hands behind her back. The crack of wood against bone echoed through the quiet residential street like a gunshot, and Maria's cry of pain and surprise cut through David's soul like a blade. Stop, David shouted, instinctively moving toward his wife, but officers Peterson and Rodriguez were already there, their hands clamping down on his arms with practiced efficiency. She's complying. She's not resisting. But compliance wasn't what these officers wanted. David watched in horror as Williams drove her knee into Maria's lower back, sending his wife crashing to the asphalt. The woman who had stood up to hostile judges and violent clients, who had faced down gang members in family court and emerged victorious, was now curled on the ground, gasping for breath. Maria, David's voice cracked as he struggled against the hands restraining him. 23 years of training, a protocol, of believing in the system. All of it crumbled as he watched Torres join Williams in the assault, his boot connecting with Maria's ribs with a sickening thud. You want to interfere with police business, Captain? Peterson hissed in David's ear, the title dripping with sarcasm. You want to see what happens when civilians don't show proper respect. Maria tried to curl into a protective ball, her social workers training screaming at her to de-escalate, to find the words that would stop this madness. But there were no words for this level of brutality, no technique in her repertoire that could reach officers who had crossed so far beyond the boundaries of human decency. Please, she gasped, blood trickling from her split lip. I have children. I work with children. Shut up, Williams screamed, raising her baton again. The blow caught Maria across her left arm, and David heard the distinct snap of breaking bone. His wife's scream of agony triggered something primal in him, something that transcended rank and protocol in 23 years of faithful service. David exploded into motion, his captain's training allowing him to break free from Peterson's grip with a technique that sent the younger officer sprawling. But Rodriguez was ready, his taser already drawn, and 50,000 volts of electricity dropped David to his knees just feet from where his wife lay bleeding. Through a haze of electrical shock, David could hear Maria sobbing his name, could see Torres' boot drawing back for another kick to her already battered torso. The streetlights blurred into streaks of light as his muscles seized and his nervous system fired randomly, but his mind remained crystal clear, recording every detail of the assault with the precision of a man who had spent decades documenting crime scenes. This is what happens, Torres panted, his face flushed with exertion and something that looked disturbingly like pleasure, when people think they're better than us, when they think their education and their fancy jobs make them special. Williams was breathing hard, her uniform disheveled, her baton now slick with Maria's blood. Maybe next time you'll remember to show some respect for the badge, she snarled, delivering one final kick to Maria's kidneys that left her retching on the pavement. David's vision cleared just as a car turned onto their street, its headlights sweeping across the scene. The four officers immediately stepped back, their body language shifting from predators to professionals with a kind of speed that spoke of long practice. "Get them up," Torres ordered quickly. Citizens complained of domestic disturbance. Subjects were uncooperative and aggressive. As Peterson hauled David to his feet, his legs still shaking from the taser, David realized he was witnessing something far worse than police brutality. This was a coordinated system of abuse, a well-oiled machine designed to destroy anyone who dared question their authority. And his wife, his beautiful, brave, broken wife, was bleeding on the asphalt because he hadn't been able to protect her from the very system he had served faithfully for over 2 decades. The emergency room at Metro General Hospital buzzed with the controlled chaos that David had witnessed countless times during his career, but never from this side of the thin blue line. He sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Maria's bed, his captain's uniform replaced by civilian clothes that felt foreign on his body, watching the steady rise and fall of his wife's chest through the maze of monitors and IV lines. 3 broken ribs, a fractured left arm, severe kidney bruising, concussion. The clinical terms felt inadequate to describe the devastation he had witnessed, the systematic destruction of the woman he loved by officers who wore the same badge he had honored for over 2 decades. Captain Santos. Dr. Jennifer Walsh appeared at his elbow, her voice soft but professional. "The police photographer finished documenting your wife's injuries. Detective Morrison from Internal Affairs is waiting to speak with you." David nodded without looking away from Maria's bruised face. Internal Affairs, the same department he had cooperated with dozens of times over the years, always confident that justice would prevail, that good cops would always protect citizens from bad ones. Now the entire foundation of his belief system lay in ruins, as battered as his wife's body. Detective Ray Morrison had been David's friend for 15 years. Their children had played together. Their wives had shared book club meetings. But the man who entered the hospital room carried himself with the careful neutrality of someone walking through a minefield. "David," Morrison said quietly, pulling up a chair. "I need to ask you some questions about what happened tonight." "What happened?" David said, his voice hoarse from shouting at the scene, "is that 4 officers from the 5th Precinct nearly beat my wife to death for asking why she was being pulled over." Morrison's pen hovered over his notepad. The officer's report states that Mrs. Santos became combative during a routine traffic stop and assaulted Officer Williams. They used necessary force to subdue her. The words hit David like physical blows. He turned to stare at his friend, seeing not the man who had stood at his wedding, but a representative of the system that had just destroyed his family. "Ray, you've known Maria for 8 years. You've seen her work with traumatized children. Watch her testify in court on behalf of abuse victims. Does that woman look like someone who assaulted a police officer?" Morrison's eyes flickered toward the bed where Maria lay unconscious, her face so swollen that she was barely recognizable. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "There's also the matter of your interference with the arrest," Morrison continued, his voice professionally detached. "Officer Peterson claims you struck him while resisting their attempts to control the situation." David felt something cold and final settle in his chest. This wasn't an investigation, it was damage control. The department wasn't seeking justice. They were building a case to protect 4 officers who had committed felony assault in full view of their captain. "You know what really happened here tonight, Ray?" David said quietly. "The question is whether you're going to do your job or whether you're going to be part of the cover-up." Morrison closed his notepad with a sharp snap. "Captain, I'd advise you to be very careful about the accusations you make. Your career, your pension, your family's future, all of that depends on how you handle the next few days." The threat hung in the air like smoke. David understood now that he faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could play along with the narrative, accept that his wife's beating was somehow justified, preserve his career and his silence, or he could tell the truth and watch everything he had worked for disappear. Maria stirred on the bed, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw David, she tried to speak, but only managed a whisper that cut through his heart like a blade. "Did you stop them?" The question would haunt him forever because the answer was no. He hadn't stopped them. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start. 6 months later, Captain David Santos stood on the courthouse steps, his resignation letter from the Metropolitan Police Department folded in his jacket pocket alongside the subpoena that had just been served to Chief Bradley Morrison. The media circus swirled around him, cameras, microphones, and reporters hungry for the story that had rocked the city's faith in its police force. Maria stood beside him, her left arm still bearing the subtle signs of the fracture that had never quite healed properly, her eyes carrying shadows that hadn't existed before that terrible night. But she was standing and she was fighting, and that was everything David needed to find his own courage. "Captain Santos," a reporter called out, Do you regret your decision to testify against your fellow officers? David looked out at the crowd, seeing faces that reminded him of every victim he had failed to protect during his years of willful blindness to the corruption within his own ranks. Torres, Williams, Peterson, and Rodriguez sat in jail cells awaiting trial for aggravated assault, civil rights violations, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Their arrests had triggered an avalanche of complaints from other victims who had finally found the courage to speak. I regret, David said, his voice carrying across the courthouse plaza, that it took seeing my wife beaten nearly to death for me to understand what so many communities have been trying to tell us for years. I regret that I wore this badge for 23 years and told myself that officers like Torres and Williams were isolated incidents instead of symptoms of a disease that I helped enable through my silence. The questions came rapid fire, but David's attention drifted to Maria, who squeezed his hand with the strength that had carried her through months of physical therapy and psychological counseling. She had insisted on pressing charges despite the threats, despite the late-night phone calls warning them to drop the case, despite the anonymous letters promising that snitches get stitches. Detective Ray Morrison had been quietly transferred to a desk job after the FBI investigation revealed his attempts to bury the case. Chief Bradley Morrison, no relation despite the shared name, had announced his early retirement when body camera footage mysteriously appeared showing the entire assault, footage that Internal Affairs had initially claimed didn't exist. The hardest part, Maria said when the reporters turned to her, wasn't the physical pain. It was watching my husband realize that the system he had devoted his life to was willing to destroy us, both to protect 4 officers who should never have worn a badge. David's phone buzzed with a text message from his new employer. The public defender's office had hired him as an investigator, putting his decades of police experience to work protecting the constitutional rights of defendants. It felt like redemption, though he knew that word would take years to earn back fully. The federal jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Torres received 8 years, Williams 7, Peterson and Rodriguez 5 each. A civil lawsuit against the department had resulted in a $2.3 million settlement and a consent decree requiring sweeping reforms. But the real victory wasn't measured in years or dollars. It was measured in the dozen other victims who had come forward, in the new training protocols that emphasized de-escalation over dominance, in the Civilian Oversight Board that now had real power to investigate police misconduct. As they walked away from the courthouse, Maria leaned against David's shoulder. Do you think it was worth it? Losing everything you worked for? David thought about his pension, his career, the friendships that had evaporated when he chose truth over loyalty. Then he looked at his wife, scared but unbroken, and thought about the badge that had once been his pride but had become his shame. I didn't lose everything, he said quietly. I found out what everything actually means. Behind them, the courthouse doors closed on one chapter of injustice, while ahead of them stretched the long road towards something resembling justice, imperfect, incomplete, but finally honestly begun.